Morning, everybody. We're just waiting for a few attendees to join. We'll get started very shortly. Hopefully everybody's having a great Tuesday afternoon now here in Sydney. We'll get started very shortly. Welcome everybody to today's webinar on conflicts of interest. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Tharawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I present from today. We pay our respect to the elders past, present and future and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. We have over 150 registered attendees for today. A little bit about CIPS, for those that don't know us, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, or CIPS, is your global professional body for procurement and supply professionals, dedicated to promoting best practice, continuous improvement in professional standards, and raising awareness of the contribution that procurement and supply management can make to organisations. But before we get started, some quick Zoom keeping. All attendees have been muted during the presentation. However, please use the chat box to write any comments you have or would like to share with all panellists and attendees. If you have a specific question you may wish to address directly to one of the panelists, then please enter them in the Q&A box and we'll attend to your questions directly at the end during the audience Q&A session. Now, a little about the webinar today and the presenter. I will quickly introduce Rob Halsall. Rob Halsall, FCIPS, is the principal at AcademyGlobal and will be a facilitator today. Rob is an experienced Chief Procurement Officer, facilitator and university lecturer. He has extensive international experience across leading automotive, chemical, telecommunications, tertiary and financial services organisations. Rob has experience in executive and board director level roles, including leadership roles driving business strategy and transformation, organisational design and operating models, program management, delivery and end-to-end procurement. In recent years, Rob has developed a particular interest in developing high-performing leaders and teams at both an executive within the corporate environment and also as an independent consultant, mentor and coach. In 2018, Rob was awarded the CIPS Australia Procurement Professional of the Year Award and the Ernst & Young New Zealand Procurement Professional of the Year. In 2019, he was the 2019 CIPS Australasia winner for both people development and risk mitigation categories. Welcome to Rob.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Gareth. Thank you so much for that intro. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in what is the latest of the CIPS ANZ webinar series, which I'm sure you'll agree have been really valuable during this challenging period. So welcome. It's great to see so many of you on board. It's my privilege to chair this discussion today in what is often a misunderstood and somewhat maligned topic. However, it is one that's extremely important from an ethical and an integrity perspective, amongst others. It's also rare that we get three very unique insights and perspectives on a topic, almost a professional probity sandwich, if you like, with Sarah being involved a great deal at the front end of the process, obviously Gareth facilitating the end-to-end procurement, and Lewis and his team obviously involved in post-completion investigations. So we're very lucky to have our three speakers, and it's my privilege to introduce them to you today because, of course, Gareth couldn't introduce himself. That would be somewhat of a conflict of interest, wouldn't it? So let's get to the introductions if we can. So Gareth Williams, obviously, who you've already heard from, is the contract delivery manager at Sydney Trains. Gareth has 8 years experience across a number of New South Wales government agencies, including the Police Force, the Department of Education, TAFE New South Wales and the Department of Justice. In his time, Gareth has worked on direct and indirect categories with a number of supplier relationship management and category management roles, as well as stints in procurement governance and e-procurement implementations. But Gareth is very passionate about the profession, as you can tell, having landed a role at the Department of Education as part of a rotation with 7 procurement cadets and graduates. So he's certainly chosen procurement as that profession. And he's invested heavily in continuing his professional development with CPD hours a number of diplomas in procurement and business-related studies. And he's recently achieved MCIPS. Congratulations, Gareth. Gareth was a runner-up for the CIPS Young Talent Award in 2018 and 2019, and he joined the CIPS New South Wales Branch Committee in mid-2019. So welcome and thank you, Gareth. We've also got Lewis Rangott, who is the Executive Director for Corruption Prevention for New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption, aka ICAC. Welcome, Lewis. Lewis started his corruption prevention career at the Commission in 2003 as a Senior Corruption Prevention Officer and Principal Officer, and he's then held senior corruption prevention roles in the public and private sectors, which will be interesting for today's discussion, before being appointed to the position of Exec Director, Corruption Prevention in May 2017. Lewis is also a certified fraud examiner, so welcome again, Lewis.
Hi, Rob,
and
thanks.
Finally, my pleasure to introduce Sarah Mullins, who's a principal at O'Connor Marsden and associate. Sarah has been providing probity services for over 15 years, including 11 years with O'Connor Marsden and previously with Deloitte. Sarah has completed over 1,800 probity engagements and has provided probity services on significant infrastructure, services and IT projects for all levels of government, with a specific focus on New South Wales and local government. Sarah is responsible within O'Connor Marsden for the development and implementation of the National Probity Handbook, as well as a range of templates and guides for all probity practitioners. In this role, Sarah co-leads the quality assurance review nationally across the firm and is frequently requested to undertake peer reviews and provide advice and QA reviews of other jurisdictions' projects. Prior to joining Deloitte, Sarah was working at the ICAC in a complaints management role and has specialized skills in the identification and management of risk, as well as fraud and corruption prevention. Sarah has also worked with a number of clients on the review of procurement practices and strategies and benchmarking these against better practice, which is obviously very beneficial for us. Sarah has a detailed understanding of New South Wales Government Procurement Policy Framework, the Commonwealth Procurement Rules, and the Victorian Purchasing Guidelines, as well as the application of these to a range of projects within government. Sarah has worked with a range of government agencies applying these policies and practices. And Sarah's also assisted the delivery of training to a range of government clients, and I've been fortunate enough to work with both Lewis and Sarah in delivering programs to public sector clients here in Australia. So welcome everyone. It's great to see you again and have your insights on what is a really valuable topic.
Glad to be here.
Great. Let's kick off. And for clarity purposes and for our webinar attendees, the ICAC, or Independent Commission Against Corruption's definition for conflict of interest, is where a reasonable person might perceive that a public official's personal interest could be favoured over their public duties. So just to expand on that for our private sector peers, replace public duties with professional duties. In essence, it's where your professional duties and personal interests overlap. So if I could, I'd like to come to Lewis as the Executive Director for Corruption Prevention at ICAC. And given the volume and variety of cases you're required to investigate, Lewis, is this a fair summary? And what do you see as the most common misconceptions regarding the understanding of conflicts of interest?
Hi, Rob. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, so really our job here at the ICAC is largely about dealing with people that are deflected from doing their public duty. And in a sense, that's encapsulated by that definition that you just expressed. So that's kind of all the stuff in our in-tray centers on this topic pretty much. I think probably the main thing that we find a challenge is encapsulating that definition that you gave there. So the definition of whether your personal interest could be favoured over your public duties or your professional duties. It's only a could test, and a lot of people mark it up and they think it's a different kind of test. So a lot of people, for instance, if you're in a procurement role and you're in a position where you could favour, for instance, a spouse or a very close personal friend, but you don't, you've got no intention of favouring them, therefore you don't have a conflict of interest, but in fact you do. The mere fact that you could favour them puts you in this land of having a conflict of interest. So people tend to muck that up, and that's one of the things we see got wrong the most times. The other thing you mentioned in your intro is it's a reasonable person test, and people obviously find it quite challenging to do a reasonable person test on their own scenario. It's quite difficult to sort of take yourself out of your own shoes, your own scenario, your own sense of your ethics, and look at your scenario from the perspective of a reasonable person. So a lot of people do what I call self-legislating. So they sit there and think, I've got a conflict, sure, I'm in a position where I could award this purchase order to a person I've got a relationship, but because I'm ethical and I'm decent and I've never done the wrong thing, therefore I don't have a conflict. So they can't really properly apply that reasonable person test, which is, I'll admit, is a big challenge. That's probably the two main things. The third one I see a lot is these things have a pecuniary element to them or a non-pecuniary element. So most people get the pecuniary stuff right. So they understand very well, if I've got shares in that company or if I own that company, then that's a big no-no. I can't effectively putting money into my own bank account. So people get that pretty intuitively, but it's also all your non-pecuniary stuff, which is your relationships. And that's where it can become quite grey. And so the rule of thumb that we have been trying to promote through our publication is anyone that's more than an acquaintance. So it's quite difficult to draw the exact bright line where a relationship with a person tips over into having a conflict. So as a rule of thumb, anyone that's more than an acquaintance, probably you're in the area where you have a conflict and probably need to disclose it in some way, shape or form. So that's probably the third one. The fourth one is when you get into the point where we actually are disclosing. What we do sometimes see is people under disclosing. So you might have a very close relationship with a person, but you undersell it. You say, oh, that person's an acquaintance when actually it's your best friend, or that person's a former business associate when in fact they're actually a current customer. So that's slightly undercooking the degree of the disclosure, which we see is a bit of a problem. The next one we see, I suppose, is when the disclosure is usually made to your manager or maybe the head of a tender panel or something like that, and then that person undercooks it. So people are generally pretty reluctant when they get it, when one of their subordinates or their colleagues say, boss, I've got a big conflict here are the details. Sort of human nature is you don't want to, that's giving off signals that person's telling the truth, they're a trustworthy person. You don't want to say, you don't overreact and say, oh, I guess I'm going to have to remove you from the tender because you're conflicted out. So often what you see, they're just undermanaged. And that's because people are a little bit reluctant to do anything or say anything that sends a signal to their colleague that they're not to be trusted, which is kind of human nature. But I suppose from my jaundiced view as an ICAC officer, lots of people aren't to be trusted. So that's a burden I have to wear by dealing with corrupt people all day long. The other couple I just mentioned briefly is some of the recent research shows that a lot of the bias that conflicted people indulge in, it's subconscious. They don't actually set out to give themselves benefits or their friends benefits. They really actually are trying to be objective and fair a lot of the time, and their bias, which is real, is subliminal or subconscious, and they can't actually really see their own bias as it's playing out in front of them. So that's an interesting little twist in some of the recent literature. I suppose the other point I just make in conclusion is that obviously ICAC deals with the public sector, and there are quite different standards between the public sector and the private sector. And especially when you see people switching from one to the other, sometimes if they bring their public sector routine across to the private sector, they're accused of being too much red tape, too much procedure, and then obviously the reverse when things go the other way. So there are two different ways of approaching some of these things, the public sector way and the private sector way, and it's a bit of a challenge sometimes. So that's a quick summary of, I suppose, the main things that we see as the problem areas.
Thank you, Lewis. I love the reference to your jaundiced view, but obviously very important in the role that you have. But thank you. That was a great answer. And Gareth, if I could come to you as a procurement professional from your perspective, where do you see the most significant challenge in the understanding and compliance to conflict of interest?
So a little bit of background about my role. I've been sort of 3 years now in a contract management focused role. I'm part of a contract management team with about 25 people embedded within the business unit, and the manage contracts and supplier relationships throughout their life cycle. One of my observations, being new in the rail industry, is it's we come across these industries from time to time that are small. Everybody knows each other. Everybody sort of worked for each other to jump between public and private, and sort of those views that people, or observations people, they may be conflicted between that. And we do need to come up with strategies to manage those situations where people are jumping between the industries. Not to say it's a bad thing; it's a great thing. The public sector is tapping into some great talent from the private sector these days, which is great to see. But sort of managing that through the contract management cycle and then into a procurement cycle, if you're going back to market, can be challenging. There is some, misconceptions out there that I've seen in a couple of agencies I've worked for, that the contract manager can't sort of be part of the tender process because they may have a conflict or some kind of unconscious bias because of their relationship that they've had with the certain suppliers over that contract life cycle. And you're right, you do pick up on things over time, and that's what we're paid for, to be really intuitive and start to understand the supplier, work really closely together. But also in our industry, we're obviously encouraged to have the highest levels of ethics and integrity, and when it comes to that sourcing process, obviously we've got a lot to offer in terms of how the supply market operates and how to extract best value. But also I feel that we should be good, or we are good at separating those observations over time and then bring it into the sourcing process so we can actually be objective about it. So that can be challenging. There's over time you hear misconceptions that you can't have a cup of coffee with a supplier. It could be misconceived by others that you're sort of too close to the supplier. It's always, for me, always easiest to not accept any gifts or benefits from any supplier at all. It's no gift or gratuity is worth your good name and stuff like that. So I just prefer to buy my own things, and there is gifts and benefits register. It's just easier to set the threshold at zero. But there's nothing wrong with sitting down and having a coffee with a supplier in a less formal environment. I find that's completely fine. And in a public space, I know in my workplace out at Clyde, there's a lot of people coming and going. It's a quite public space, and it's quite normal business that people are sitting down having coffee with each other, even with suppliers. So as I said, my role is predominantly focused on the contract management cycle, but obviously contribute a lot to sourcing events. And being in government, I've been in government my whole sort of procurement career. The tendering process is focused on being quite sanitized, a very clean process. Maybe not, but I think we need to operate within the concepts and principles. We need to fully understand those concepts and principles, and that will give you some of those. It'll help you determine when you come across those certain situations that can become challenging, that those principles and concepts will guide you quite often. Trying to write them into rules and procedures and very rigid sort of flow charts sometimes can be challenging. But if it's underpinned by a very thorough establishing base level, normally you should be okay. But if you should always seek advice when you come across a situation that you feel uncomfortable about. That's what I always think as well. No harm in asking the questions, and that's it.
Thank you, Gareth. Great perspective. And Sarah, as a principal at O'Connor Marsden, someone who provides a great deal of guidance on probity from pre to post procurement projects, what is your view on the most common misconceptions regarding the understanding and application of conflicts of interest?
Thanks, Rob. And the benefit of going last is that I can just say, yeah, I agree with everything that Lewis and Gareth just said. No, there's a couple of things that I would add to that. I think a few of the things that we notice in the advice that we provide is that it's not just about declaring once and then saying, yes, we've ticked the conflict of interest box. So a lot of the procurements that we work on could go for a significant period of time. And I am going to talk mostly around the sort of procurement and the sourcing stage, because that's effectively majority of the time that we get asked to provide probity advice. But it's not just around disclosing it at the beginning of the process and then not updating those at any particular points in time, because we've had some procurements that have gone for over a year or a 2-year period. Lots of people's interests can change significantly in that period of time. So it's making sure that you've got mechanisms in place, that you're refreshing those, reminding people of the need to make sure that they're updating their disclosures if there's any changes to their personal circumstances and those sorts of things. One of the other things that we do notice quite a lot, and when we've been reading, not the ICAC material, but there's some other material out there that talks about, conflicts of interest and the risks associated with that, there's a lot of focus on the need to manage conflicts of interest to make sure that there's no undue influence in the decision-making process. One of the things that can sometimes get left off a little bit is the need to manage and consider access to information. So it's not just about making sure that there's no undue influence during the process, but it's making sure that if someone has disclosed a material conflict of interest which requires them to remove themselves from a decision-making process, so it might be that they're on a steering committee, they might be on a board where they're dealing with a number of matters, and they might and councils is one of the areas where we do notice this as well. They will remove themselves from the decision-making point when that particular matter comes up. But it's not just about that. It's making sure that the papers that are circulated to them, for example, are actually redacted papers that are taking away their access to information that's confidential. Because if, for example, it's a pecuniary interest, it may be that those papers have got commercial in confidence information in them about a competitor's bid, for example. That's not something that the market will necessarily want everybody to know. So particularly where there might be a disclosed interest. The last thing that I'll probably add just to this question is that there is a little bit of a misconception from our perspective on the view that if you disclose a conflict of interest, you automatically need to be removed from the process. And that's not necessarily the case. And a lot of the guidance material that's out there, including ICAC's conflicts of interest guidelines, talks about a number of strategies for managing conflicts. And in the work that we've done, and I've been working in this space for quite a period of time, it would need to be quite a significant conflict for someone to actually need to be removed from the process. A lot of the time you can manage it through documenting it, making sure that the rest of, for example, the evaluation panel are aware that a conflict has been disclosed. You can look at ways at changing someone's role on the evaluation. So for example, if you still want to make sure that you've got their technical expertise, and it comes to Gareth's point around incumbent contractors and contract management roles, they'll have a lot of expertise that you still want to be able to draw on as part of the evaluation. But it's looking at, well, do we actually make them a voting member, for example, of the panel, or do we manage the conflict by making them a technical advisor and then having a sort of a bigger group around them to support that evaluation, so that from an undue influence or a perception point of view, they'd actually have to influence quite a significant number of people for that to then create a risk in relation to the procurement. So they're kind of just the things that we've noticed on top of the comments that sort of Lewis and Gareth have made already.
Brilliant, thank you, Sarah. I mean, that's some great points there in terms of not necessarily does it mean you have to be removed from the process. And obviously you have to manage that conflict appropriately depending on the scenario. And I also like the point around, it's not a static thing, conflict of interest, as you made the point you referred to around the length of projects that are being delivered. It's certainly not static. It's a fluid from sourcing or planning through to contract management. I think that's a really, really valid point. So thank you for that. Let's move to the second question, if I can, and maybe if I can stay with you, Sarah. Are you able to share some insights into what could be seen as leading practice in ensuring conflicts of interest are considered with the entire end-to-end procurement lifecycle? So not just in the sourcing component, and where you've experienced gaps, maybe in process design or operating effectiveness?
Yep. So I guess coming back to my point before around, and it isn't a static sort of one-off thing, I think it's important that they are revisited at various parts in the process so that you are capturing it not just as part of the sourcing, and it might be at various components of that sourcing process, but that you are capturing it throughout a particular a project or whatever it is that you're dealing with. I think there's also a need for agencies to consider how a disclosed conflict is going to be managed post the procurement process. So say, for example, if someone on the evaluation panel has disclosed a conflict that that is significant and they may need to be removed from the process, if their role going forward is going to be a contract management or some other sort of role, that conflict doesn't stop existing just because the procurement process is finished. So you need to actually consider how that's going to be managed beyond that. So what their role will be in relation to the contract management. Are they going to be responsible for work allocation in panel arrangements, for example, because that's somewhere where that conflict could come up again, as well as where there might be reviewing and approving invoices for payment. So it's looking at it from beyond the procurement process and saying, well, just because the procurement is finished doesn't necessarily mean that that conflict no longer exists and no longer has the opportunity to have an impact on their decision making. The other thing to note is, and I've mentioned before about some of the ICAC guidelines, but there's also some interesting material that's coming out of agencies such as the Queensland Integrity Commission. So they're looking at that concept that I talked about before, by not automatically excluding a person from a process where, for example, a pecuniary interest might exist. So I know in New South Wales, in local government, it's legislatively set up so that if they just have a pecuniary interest, they're automatically removed from the process and they can't be involved in any decision making, any meetings, etc. So the Queensland Integrity Commission is looking at that, but looking at whether there's that actual potential for that interest to influence the decision making. So it's not just looking at it in a blanket way, but it's looking at them on a case-by-case basis and seeing whether or not there is the potential for that to actually impact on the decision. And it also had a look, the Queensland Integrity Commission materials also looked at that concept of apprehended bias. And there's a really good case law example, and I won't go into detail on it, but I would encourage people to Google it after this webinar. But and it sounds really silly, but it's about Izzy the dog. And it's a really interesting case where they demonstrated that there was a case of apprehended bias in the sense that the conflict existed because the person involved wasn't actually bringing an impartial mind to the decision. They were motivated by the fact that they wanted their original decision to be reinforced because obviously they made the decision in the first place. So it wasn't looking so much at personal versus public interest, but it was looking at that motivation to make sure that their original decision was effectively upheld. So that's some sort of other areas where conflicts have come into play, but I would encourage people to do a search for that case, because it's an entertaining one, but it is also quite a good example.
Thank you, Sarah. I will be Googling Izzy the dog afterwards. Absolutely. Thank you. And Lewis, can I come to you on the same question, please?
Thanks, Rob. Yes, I just, as Sarah was speaking, I just said, yes, I will also look up that case, and I just realised what a boring person I am. So perhaps we're all kindred spirits, I don't know, but I really like those apprehended bias cases as well, because there's all sorts of ways to come to a bad decision, and having a conflict of interest, I suppose, is just one of them. So in one sense, if you just engineer your decision-making processes so it's all geared towards getting the absolute best value for money you can, even if you've got undisclosed, concealed conflicts of interest, you're giving you the best possible chance of getting the right outcome. The classic is just knowing the market for the thing that is you're buying. So we've, for instance, found occasions in the past where someone's been able to convince their superiors that it was a particular type of supply was worth, $2,000 a day of contractors' time, which was, triple the going rate. So if you know the market rate, your exposure to losses is greatly reduced. But the other thing I thought I would just add is that I suppose in my role, generally we don't make corrupt conduct findings about people that are procurement professionals. Generally, if we're making corrupt conduct findings, it's about the buyer. So the person who's the buyer, so they're the IT expert or the security services expert, or the person that's buying whatever it is you're buying, they're the ones that are most likely to be really networked in with the suppliers, and they're most likely to have pecuniary interests and relationships. So they're kind of more, with respect, the problem area. So I think my part of the solution is, in an appropriate way, just trying to even the balance between giving the actual procurement professionals a little bit more power and influence over the thing. So often I find that in public sector agencies that have really had to cut costs, or they're under pressure to just meet urgent deadlines, the procurement professional doesn't have a lot of power, doesn't have as much time as they'd like to have, and the buyer has too much influence. And the poor procurement professional gets stuck in checkbox land, or all they can do is just point the buyer to the policy and say, please follow the policy. That's an area I'd really like to see improved, at least in the public sector. And another area, and I think Gareth touched on it earlier, is I think incumbent, well-performing suppliers do create a little bit of a challenge. And I know that Sarah's organisation gives lots of advice on, how should you deal with an incumbent? So I suppose in my view, a really well-performing incumbent should get some sort of a natural advantage. You know, they've been there performing well. Why should you be obliged to put that out of your mind? I suppose for the same reason, if they're performing really badly, you shouldn't have to put that out of your mind as well. So I think some natural advantages and disadvantages should just normally accrue to an incumbent. There is a bit of a problem if, you know, the contract manager who's been working side by side with that supplier for, you know, 5 years, say, that they probably have formed some sort of an attachment. They may well have gone beyond the cup of coffee. Maybe they've become friends. Maybe they carpool together. Maybe they socialise to get together. So that should be disclosed. But as Sarah has mentioned, you still want the knowledge and expertise of that person involved in the process, but you wouldn't give them end-to-end control, for instance. So I think it's quite, if they've got a really well-performing incumbent, then they should get some national advantages. And if they get an easier run to a contract renewal, so be it. That's the advantage you get from being good, I think. So that's all fine to me. I suppose a few of the little red flags that we see a very strong association, a strong correlation between direct negotiations or non-competed work and conflicts of interest. So corrupt people and people that are conflicted to the eyeballs hate having to compete in a fair way for the work. They'd rather cut all those corners, get a contract given to them directly. So they'll do all sorts of things like split the job below the tendering threshold, split orders, go for variations, all that sort of stuff. So again, that gets back to designing the process that gives you the best value for money. So so generally, especially when it gets in the land of corrupt conduct, you're looking for deviations from your documented processes, and direct negotiations is a bit of a classic for us. And we've got a separate publication just on that. The other one I see a little bit is, especially in COVID times, I've seen a little bit of abuse of fake or contrived emergency procurement. So at least in the public sector here in New South Wales, they've just changed the rules slightly around emergency procurement. You can understand why, because to deal with the pandemic. But I've seen a few cases on my desk where everything's an emergency. I need to buy this new computer, it's an emergency. I need to go and pay this consultant, you know, $500,000. That seems like an emergency as well. And it's a little bit of abuse of that, which I've seen from time to time. Gareth, I hope I'm not trespassing on the comments Gareth is about to make, but I think the thing about gifts is I think procurement officers are in a higher risk role, and they do have to have slightly higher standards when it comes to gifts. So really, especially if you're in the middle of planning or the sourcing stage, you really kind of got to be in a gift-free zone. I do accept what Gareth says about once you sort of post-award and you're working side by side with a supplier to deliver services or deliver things for your organisation, that the complexion of things changes a little bit. But even the smell of gifts during the sourcing phase creates sometimes complaints to ICAC, and you might as well not avoid all of that. And I suppose the other things the thing I would just note is sometimes people sometimes get into trouble when they're trying to be helpful, and a lot of procurement I see, it's people aren't setting out to place themselves in a conflict of interest. They're not planning to confer benefits on their friends and their relatives, but sometimes something just pops up opportunistically and someone says, oh, I really need to buy X. Does anyone know someone that sells X? And without, you instinctively just go, yeah, I know someone that sells X. I'm an expert in X myself, and I've got all these friends that sell X, and all of a sudden you've just zigged when you sort of zagged, if you know what I mean. So often we joke around the office, it's one of those, does anybody know a guy that sells X type situations? And so that's sometimes an area where people just lapse a little bit because they're thinking about, you know, achieving something for a client or delivering on something for their internal client, and they just foul things up ever so slightly. So that kind of answers your question, Rob, but I'm sure Gareth can pick up on anything that we've missed there.
I love that answer, and I love the point you raised, Lewis, around that natural advantage if you're a well-performing incumbent. I think that's something that we probably have a fear around, you know, or it's a grey area for some, but also that direct negotiation and corruption correlation, I think, is a really relevant point. And actually, I mean, I would recommend anybody, private or public sector, to read the ICAC guidelines on direct negotiation, because they're excellent. Number one, they're very clear, and they provide clear rationale for when, you know, direct negotiations can be appropriate or not. I think it's an excellent guide for anybody. So thank you for sharing that. And Gareth, if I can come to you then on the same question, obviously in managing procurement projects or being part of that procurement project, where do you experience the gaps in process design or operating effectiveness?
Yeah, so a few of the comments from Lewis and Sarah sort of struck a chord with me. I will be also Googling the apprehended bias recent example, because I can see the relevance of that. As human beings, we're all proud people. And if you make a decision, on behalf of the agency or your company, and then you would obviously favour it and try and defend that decision going forward. So I can see the relevance of that case for sure. Also, I agree with sort of the comments from Lewis, is that sometimes the focus is heavily put into the procurement or the contract management folk in terms of training and ongoing development, in terms of integrity and ethics training and stuff like that. But often what I see is that the larger risk is actually in the consumer of the goods. The buyer, as Lewis was saying, is they're often the ones that are directing the work, making those individual engagements off a panel, for example, or if we have a single supplier, but they're the ones directing the work on the front line. And obviously they need that autonomy to direct the work, to get the work done out on the weekends, for example. But I can see that as the risk is when, engineers or for example, all well-intentioned to sort of keep motoring on, but can sometimes undermine all the work of the procurement professional, and not just in the process, but also can undermine value as well. Obviously, in some industries, the incumbents have a large advantage because they understand your organisation, warts and all. Sometimes that can mean that they miss out on the work because they actually understand the challenges of dealing with you, so they price it appropriately, and sometimes they miss out. But at the same time, knowing your organisation can obviously see them, at an advantage through the tendering process, because they know how to operate or engage with you throughout the contract life cycle. And some industries, obviously, new entrants are more challenging than others. In some industries, it's easier for new entrants to come and go, but other ones, there's more challenges involved with that. Obviously, the emergency procurement one, that also struck a chord, because I always see the biggest risk in government is particularly at the end of financial year, sort of May, June, July. Oh, sorry, probably April, May, June, because everybody's, it's the old spend it or lose it type thing with budgets. So there's this real acceleration of work or activity to try and utilise the budgets. And maybe that's not the best way of achieving best value, but it's a perverse sort of incentive where if you don't spend your budget, budget gets reduced next year. And particularly this year has been, it's been more exaggerated than ever because of COVID as well. With accelerated maintenance in a lot of, or some industries, construction, the acceleration of work has required people to actually get out there and spend more money quickly. And that's a really risky time that I see. And also receiving purchase orders, receiving work before the work is actually performed, just to get the money spent. That's a really big risk for me. But in terms of, the policies and procedures themselves, I think some of these things need a periodic review across the board. I often see that you might have a 60-page document that's been in place for many, many years. And we see a challenge, we have an audit that sort of says, this is a gap here. And we sort of essentially put a Band-Aid on that hole on the bucket. And then sort of in the next year, we see that, no, this is a bit of a challenge. We put a Band-Aid on that one. And suddenly we've just got this policy of patchwork. And sometimes I think you need to go back to the drawing board and start to look at the principles and concepts, and then start getting into the detail of redesigning. Obviously not throwing away what you've already got, because it's a good starting point. But when policies can become that sort of complicated, they're no longer workable. They're no longer effective in managing the risk that it's trying to manage. I see that quite a bit. And yeah, I think that's an opportunity to make it easier to drive, because we should try and make it as easy as possible to be compliant. But, the process quite often is quite logical, but then we can actually start making it more complicated than it really should be, whilst, maintaining all of the high levels of ethics and standards.
Great, thank you, Gareth. Good points there again around that economic or technical buyer having the influence on the process, not necessarily procurement. And also, I think that kind of situation where you've got an acceleration of spend, which is obviously great to stimulate the economy as well, post-COVID as well. But obviously there's it needs to be done appropriately and managed appropriately. And I like the point you raised around periodic review of policy or process. Okay, so let's before we go to the final question at the moment, before panning to audience questions, it's great to see we've got several questions coming through on the Q&A already. So I would encourage everyone who would like to ask a question, please get their question through on that Q&A. We're going to have one more question to the panel before we refer to your questions. So please, if you've got any burning questions on conflict of interest, got a great panel here who will be able to answer your questions. So let's go to the third question from me, which is, there's no doubt in managing or facilitating conflict of interest during the procurement life cycle that this creates an ongoing challenge for procurement teams within the public and private sectors, given they are seen as the custodians of the market engagement and supplier relationship management process. So there is significant legislation and regulation within both sectors, and procurement teams are very often labelled with making the process too challenging for their stakeholders, which is a point that really, Gareth touched on. So Lewis, with guidance, what guidance would you share with procurement teams to assist them in managing this challenge and maybe reframing the objectivity that's required, whether that's education or training or reporting? If you could maybe give us an insight, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think, Rob, in your remarks there, you said often they're seen as the custodians. I think sometimes that's the problem, that they're not. And so there's, a conflict of interest might be surfaced, and okay, it's been, the piece of paper might go to the head of the tender panel or someone, but is that person really, has that been handed off really to the right person who actually is responsible for dealing with it? Or does it fall through a gap? Or even if it is that person's job, are they clever enough to do it? And that's how, Sarah's company makes some of its money. It specialises in coming in and saying, hang on, you guys can't sort these things out for yourselves. Let us sort them out. So if you've got a probity person on the scene, you can say, here, probity person, give me some advice and we'll follow your advice. And that works really well. But often it just falls between that gap between, the buyer and the procurement professional. I suppose if you can just have a clear, repeatable rule that says when there's one of these conflicts of interest, this is how it's going to be dealt with, and it doesn't get missed. That would really help a lot, I think. And I think the other way to maybe just psychologically deal with it is, because as we discussed at the start, people sometimes misinterpret having a conflict as equating that with having done the wrong thing, which is just not the case at all. So instead of saying, please disclose your conflicts, what you can do is you can reframe it as, please disclose your relationships, please disclose your interest, not your conflicts of interest. And that can make people a little bit happy to say, well, I used to work in this industry and I know these people really well, and I drink beers with those people, but I went to university with those people, and you get all the relationships out. And as Sarah said, you still need to keep on top of those as the procurement unfolds, but that's a different question to please tell us your conflicts, which can be more challenging for people to answer. So that's a way to just trick people into telling you what they you need them to tell you. The other thing we're on a bit of a mission about at the moment at ICAC is we see that supplier due diligence could be done a lot better. Sometimes it's done really well. It tends to be done really, really well on a big spend. And again, it tends to be done really well when you've got, someone like Sarah's firm involved, because they'll either do it for you or they'll guide you along the way. But there's, you sort of see quite these odd problematic areas where it's done quite poorly, and you'll see things where we come along and investigate, wow, if you just Googled the name of the supplier, you would have found that it was owned by the person who's your advisor or something. Or if you could have worked out that this company that purports to be a global giant in engineering services run out of a garage, at the back end of Chester Hill or something. So basic free due diligence is... it feels like a chore, but if there's a way that you can, I think it's a way that procurement professionals can help add a bit of value to the process or take some of the risk out of the process. And I think with respect, a procurement professional is going to do that better than a buyer. Now, sometimes you need help from legal and so on. So not to plug yet another ICAC publication, but we have done a publication on supply due diligence because we see it done really very badly in these areas, but I don't make money every time I plug these things. I suppose the other thing that I find very frustrating is often you'll see senior management and like executive level people in your company or your your public sector agency, and they'll sign off on the procurement policy, and they'll pretend that they're in favour of following the procurement policy, but they often will just turn a blind eye to breaches of your own policy because they're kind of more aligned with their buyers and achieving their goals. And it's hugely frustrating when senior management just tolerate quite bad breaches of the company's policy, and that it really makes it hard for procurement to do its job. It's basically sending a signal to the rest of the organisation that procurement can just be ignored, and it's a huge source of frustration. So they'll show up and say, yes, this is the policy, and then out the other side of their face, they'll quietly encourage their own staff to split orders or cut corners or not do their due diligence or hold secret meetings without the procurement people there. Those types of things are very, very frustrating. So I suppose the other thing I might mention just to close is that here in New South Wales, Sarah's not going to thank me at all for saying this. I'll get in big trouble with her. But a few years ago, the public sector in New South Wales put out a memo that says, really, you should be able to do your own most of your own probity work in-house, and you should only be relying on external companies like Sarah's in exceptional circumstances, or it's beyond your capability. And I think people in Sarah's industry thought, oh no, we're about to be put out of business because all of a sudden the probity expertise inside public sector agencies is going to suddenly start going up, and that hasn't quite happened. And so I still think there's a very important role for companies like Sarah's and her competitors to play. But I really would love to see, I suppose, more talks like this where part of the skill set of being a procurement professional is also having a pretty good grounding in a lot of the probity stuff. So just quietly, as the years tick by, just very quietly and slowly put Sarah out of business. And I think that would be a good outcome for everyone except possibly Sarah.
Thank you, Lewis. Very comprehensive. Thank you. And Sarah, if I can come to you with the same question, please. Obviously, don't want to put you out of business, but if you can give your perspective on this.
No, that's okay. And look, I 100% agree with everything that Lewis is saying. And part of the area where we feel like the best value is added is actually where you're upskilling your clients to be able to look at these risks and identify how they're going to manage them themselves, not just conflicts of interest, but across all of the areas that we provide advice on. If your probity advisor for government or for public private sector, if you are engaging them, but if your probity advisor is not assisting in upskilling your team to be able to identify risks themselves and manage them themselves, then I don't think you're actually getting the full sort of benefit of engaging that kind of expertise. So I do agree with Lewis in that respect. The one area that I was actually going to talk about, Lewis has touched on already, the thing that I think we notice, and a lot of the new publications sort of in the last 18 months to 2 years that are coming out around conflicts of interest are looking at that whole reframing and about the language that's actually used for conflict. So I will sort of repeat some of what Lewis has talked about, but I think it's a really important thing to note because if you're talking about a conflict, it automatically sets a bit of a negative view in terms of someone seeing that I have a conflict and therefore that's wrong. But it's actually having a conflict in itself is not wrong. Everyone outside of their work has got private interests that at some point in your career is potentially going to come into contact with the work that you do as a public official or in your role in procurement if you're in the private sector. So having a conflict in itself is not wrong. I think it's reframing the language, as Lewis has indicated, to ask people to actually disclose their associations and their interests. The two reasons for that is firstly, because I think it sets a better language and it sets a better expectation as to what it is you're trying to manage and takes that negativity away from it. But it also reinforces that reasonable person test, because it shouldn't ever be up to the person who's got the association to make a decision on whether or not that constitutes a conflict. And Lewis has talked about some examples of that before, and there's also a couple of really good recruitment panel examples in the ICAC publication relating to that specifically. So it should never be about the person who's got the association to make a decision on whether or not it's got a conflict of interest. It's about disclosing that interest, and for non-conflicted members, so whether that's the evaluation panel, whether it's a steering committee, whether it's your direct line manager, but it's up to them to look at that and say, okay, is that something that could give rise to a conflict of interest? If it is, how do we manage it and what's the best way to manage it? So I think talking about it in that language sense is something that needs to be sort of looked at going forward. And a lot of the declarations that we see as part of procurement processes that we're on still talk about a conflict of interest disclosure form, whereas it's actually better to refer to that, for example, as a declaration of associations, because then it reinforces that language. The other thing just to note, and I did, I'm going to steal a little bit of your role, Rob, but I have had a quick look at the some of the Q&A questions, and I think there's one that's relevant there to this particular question that we're talking about, and that's a question on timing of when you're in a procurement process, when the best time is to ask people to disclose, whether it's just you wait until once you've got your tender responses in and therefore you know who your respondents are, or whether you get people to disclose up front. The view that we take on that from our perspective as a probity advisor is if you're looking to do a large procurement or any sort of procurement process, you automatically have a pretty rough idea as to who your market's going to be. So if you're going to be a member of the evaluation panel on that particular procurement process, even without knowing who your respondents are, you'll have a pretty good idea as to whether or not you know someone or you've got a financial interest for something that's actually going to create a conflict for you. So we would suggest that you get your conflict of interest form signed up front, and then you revisit it at various milestones. And it's not that you're getting them to sign new conflict forms, but you might just ask them to reconfirm that there's no changes to their conflicts once, for example, you get your tender responses in. Another time that we would suggest that you revisit that is when you are going through in detail tender responses, because it will be then that you're going through and looking at who they've nominated on their project team, what consultants they've identified, which you won't necessarily know if you're just looking at the tender list in the first instance. So it's at those points when you're going to more of a deep dive into the tender responses that you would revisit that and say, well, now that I know more detail about that response, I'm comfortable to confirm there's no change in conflicts. So it's those are sort of the other things that I'd add on top of what Lewis has already talked about.
Brilliant, Sarah. I love those points. And I love what you're doing there is kind of demystifying conflict of interest, really. You know, it's okay to have a conflict, but you obviously need to declare that and disclose that and manage it appropriately. But also the point you raised there around timing, you know, upfront and at appropriate intervals afterwards. Really good guidance. And thanks for jumping into the questions. Because we're going to have to answer some rapid fire after we hear from Gareth on this last question. So Gareth, as a procurement practitioner and hearing from Lewis and Sarah, do you believe there's further room for improvement in the approach taken by procurement teams to balance conflict of interest requirements and stakeholder understanding? Maybe you could share with us. And if you do, what would they be?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll keep it reasonably quick, but look, procurement as an industry, I find, is not really rocket science, a commercial approach to gaining business outcomes. But although you might not need a university degree, what we do, there is some specialised knowledge and that may be acquired through training courses to understand the do's and don'ts and to understand those true principles and concepts of fair dealing, including the management of conflict of interest. You know, I really do like the terminology or sort of the rephrasing that Sarah's sort of alluded to about, you know, but calling it more of a declaration of interest and associations. And to Lewis's point, you know, the guidance did come out a couple of years ago about the sort of potential overuse of probate advisors being, you know, potentially used by other people to sort of outsource the risk and as an insurance policy. And to me, I don't feel that I can outsource my own due diligence and my curiosity in terms of who I'm going to be dealing with in the future. And look, there are times and places to engage probity advice. As Sarah said, it needs to be not just focused on that individual sourcing activity, but also needs to be an education approach. And I really think that, as Lewis said, that the procurement professional in the room, you know, it is sort of our job to bring sort of some probity, sort of at least some basics to the table and sort of to really sort of, you know, try and manage the situation with, you know, all the concepts and principles. And, you know, if there is any sticking points that you have or any challenges, there are always people to ask. So don't feel like you're pressured in the room to have all the answers right there. So yeah, trying to think, that's probably about it for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Gareth. I think that's a great point. Just don't be afraid to ask, you know, don't feel that pressure. You know, it's a collective thing as well. Ask your peers. So we've got some rapid fire Q&A now. We've got about 6 minutes before we need to close the webinar. So let's go to a question from Kay Bedford, thank you, Kay. Contract managers on tender evaluation panels is definitely an area where there are different opinions on the conflict of interest aspects. I would be interested to hear if there are other views. Maybe we could go to Lewis and Sarah initially on that. Just so, what's your view on contract managers being on that evaluation panel? Lewis.
So in terms of rapid fire, so look, there is a risk that that person is going to have a relationship with an incumbent, and you imagine on a case-by-case basis. I'd be reluctant to give that person, if that's the case, that person too much power. They have to have some sort of a seat at the table, and a good compromise might be that they become a technical advisor, or they do a lot of work on the tender, but maybe they're not necessarily a decision maker. But that's just one point of view.
And I think the only thing I'd add, sorry, Rob. The only thing I'd add to that is that I think it's also important to note that the views that the contract manager may have on a incumbent contractor may not always be positive. So it may be that they've dealt with them for the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and they're just like, oh my God, can we just not go with these guys again because they've caused all sorts of problems. But from a probity perspective, our position is always, if they're responding to the tender, and this is going a little bit beyond the question of putting them on the evaluation panel, but it's more around how you deal with that from a risk point of view, rather than, so making sure that you're taking that into account from a risk point of view, but it's the point at which you consider it as part of the evaluation, and potentially from a procedural fairness point of view, giving that incumbent contractor a right of reply if there are negative views in relation to them that may have a detrimental impact on the assessment of their response. So you can take it into consideration, but you would do that through your validation and your due diligence activities, by seeking references and making sure that like performance management of that contractor is documented, so you're not relying on one person's view of how bad this contract went, because ultimately it could be a personality clash, it could be a number of reasons that may not necessarily be linked to their performance.
Great point. Procedural fairness, really, really appropriate. And we've seen a thank you from apologies, not if I haven't mispronounced your name, but on the question that you asked earlier, which Sarah referred to. So thank you for your answer on that. And also, let's go just mention that Jenny Christensen has said there's some good IBAC definitions on the actual potential and perceived conflict of interest, which I think is a really good point. Just, you know, differentiating those. And Jenny's gone on to say, in her experience, public sector tends to be guided in major procurements by probity advisors or audit, whereas in private and non-for-profit, it's less rigorous. I wouldn't disagree with that at all, Jenny. Jennifer Lawrence, not from Hollywood, but I'm guessing from somewhere here in Australia. So Jennifer Lawrence, thank you. You weren't aware that the scope of ICAC was restricted to the public sector, so that's good for you, I guess, to understand that. And is there a suitable body that can review and adjudicate on private sector issues of conflict of interest? Anybody want to, Lewis, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think Jennifer mentions legal options there. So your lawyer is basically the first port of call there. So if someone's done you a civil wrong, then you place it in the hands of your lawyers. But and you're in the world of contract law there. But there's you know, a lot of private sector contracts have mediation clauses in them, for instance. But I'm not particularly well versed in that. But it's an area where contract lawyers make a little bit of money.
Thank you. Really, really sorry for anybody we didn't get back to now. We'll try and address those questions post-webinar. I'd like to refer back to Gareth now. Firstly, thank you all for your participation, and thanks for everybody who wrote questions and attended the webinar. Hopefully you found it valuable. I'd like to switch over to Gareth now to round up the webinar. Thank you, Gareth.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Thanks for that. So we have a number of upcoming events. So the next one is the CIPS Victoria branch, in partnership with KPMG Australia, are inviting you to join us for a webinar on the new Australian Payment Times Reporting Act, which is fast approaching and will become law on the 1st of January 2021. This webinar is taking place at 12 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time tomorrow, or 2 p.m. New Zealand time. And we also have a further New South Wales branch event, which is the annual Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. Well, it's slightly morphed this year to a Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner an opportunity for everybody to get together in these years we haven't seen each other in 3D. Places are limited, so get in quickly to book for that one. Yeah, so please join. So thank you for everything today. To all attendees, I hope you found the webinar insightful. And before you leave today, please take a few minutes for our post-webinar survey. A copy of the webinar and a list of any unanswered questions will be emailed to you by the end of the week. Thank you.